Changing a country isn't easy, but change is inevitable, and the choices we make today will shape our country for generations to come. That's why we've published our first book from Australia Institute Press. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Bob Brown, Sally McManus, Dr. Emma Shortis, and Professor Brian Schmidt. The essays are a roadmap and a reminder that the solutions exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Visit australiainstitute.org.au or follow the link in the show notes to order your copy of What's the Big Idea today.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
Hi, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains economics, politics, and policy in plain English. I'm Alice Grundy, the Managing Editor of Australia Institute Press. At the 2022 federal election, Australia elected a record number of independents and minor parties to the House of Representatives, and at the upcoming election, many analysts think minority government is the most likely outcome. Clearly, politics as usual isn't enough for many voters. So why did this major political realignment happen? And what do our changing voting habits mean for the future of Australian democracy? In today's episode, the first in our summer book club series, I was joined by veteran journalist George Megalogenis. George joined me to discuss why the status quo political culture is under pressure, and his latest quarterly essay, Minority Report, The New Shape of Australian Politics. This conversation was recorded on December 6, 2024, as part of our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinar series, and some things may have changed since recording. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, George, to talk about your latest quarterly essay, Minority Report.
How are you, Alice?
Very well, thank you. So, in this essay, you go as far back as Andrew Fisher's government to talk about the effects of economic shocks. And economic shocks are, again, a subject for this essay. What have you noticed more recently? And what do you think some of the anti-incumbency trends that we've been seeing around the world are? Do you think they're coming here too?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I might flag straight off the top that I've changed my thinking on one particular issue. And this is where how I interpret shocks now has changed a bit with the hindsight of not only the global financial crisis, but also the global pandemic of 2020 and 2021. Sort of view that as a 2-year episode because they were the years of lockdown for most people. Most people out of Victoria, obviously, probably less so. Now, when I was sort of reporting through the global financial crisis and then sort of getting my head around the aftermath, you had a Labor government then in its first term, led by Kevin Rudd, that handled that thing probably better than any other developed nation on earth. We avoided a hard landing. Our unemployment rate didn't even cross 6%, where in the US and the UK it sort of gets to 10%. They call it a Great Recession. We call it a global financial crisis. But that government didn't last. In the sort of unwinding from that sort of stimulus phase to the return to some sort of new normal, there was a collapse in the government's standing with the people. And of course, Labor panicked after Kevin Rudd walked away from the great moral challenge of climate change. At the time, I thought it was that policy decision that sort of triggered the government's demise. Well, the demise, obviously, the Rudd government and then the Gillard government going into minority government. But looking back now through the second lens of the pandemic in 20 and 21, you see almost the same pattern. A big surge in approval for the government during the crisis. The government itself is writing these blank checks to sort of keep you safe. In 2008-9, it was to avoid a recession. They gave you money to spend as an act of patriotic duty. And in 2020 and 2021, they give you a lot more money to stay at home so you don't catch the virus, or if you did catch it, that you weren't going to spread it. Both those governments look really, really good in the crisis. And when we look at the the sort of survey reports on trust in institutions, trust in democracy, trust in the federal, state, local government, judiciary, police force, even media, maybe not so much media, they all surge during the crisis and then come back to sort of their pre-crisis, more cynical levels after the crisis has passed. And so having now had the benefit of that sort of second global shock case study, I sort of now detect a trust bubble, a boom and bust in trust. And that is the rally around the flag during the crisis. The aftermath is really, really scratchy. These things almost now have a wartime quality to them. Famously, both Bushes, George Bush Sr. and George Bush Jr., achieved approval ratings during the first Iraq War and September 11 around 90%. And neither of those presidencies survived the aftermath. Bush did get a second term, but he was very, very quickly without control of the Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate. And Bush Sr. was a one-term president. Now, the one most Australians would sort of know in the back of their mind is the Churchill effect. Great wartime leader, first election after the end of the Second World War, they punt him for a Labor government, first majority Labor government in the United Kingdom. So that's the theory, and it's a new one for me. As I say, I've almost had to revisit the global financial crisis to get my head around why the history repeated and probably why I got it wrong the last time. I didn't feel like I'd got it wrong at the time, but looking back on it, there was much more to it than just the alleged incompetence of the Rudd-Gillard government. It was a global phenomenon too. Governments were falling all over the place. Didn't really matter about their length of tenure. And this is in the aftermath, by the way, not during the shock itself. And we know now, looking back through 2020 and 2021, we had 5 state and territory governments stand for re-election. They all got back comfortably. And in WA, there was a landslide. Since reopening in 2022, we've had 8 elections, including a federal election. 5 of the 8 governments got thrown out. So we're in that anti-incumbent cycle in the aftermath of a global shock that is, weirdly, for the household, a positive income shock because of all the money the government's doling out. But in the aftermath of that global shock, you've got the government trying to get the budget back into surplus. You've got the Reserve Bank increasing interest rates. You've got people wondering what the hell this good news of this soft landing is really all about, because it doesn't feel like that at the kitchen table. I think that's where we are now. But we are now in a third economic shock, really, of the 21st century. If you take the GFC, the health-induced recession, the pandemic, now it's the inflation shock. And inflation's really come straight after reopening. Now that shock, your history tells you, certainly your history of the 70s, it's very anti-incumbent. Inflation is probably more than any other sort of global force, a government killer. It's very difficult for the government of the day to be able to tell the people this is something beyond our control, but if we stick together, we'll get through it, which is your financial crisis or your pandemic. Your inflation scenario is very difficult to explain to people in a political sense why it is you have to hurt them in the short term, why the cure in many instances is worse than the disease for them, to get price stability restored. I wouldn't want to be a leader now. The easiest job at the moment in politics is that of opposition leader, because you just say, things, are you better off than you were a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? The answer is obviously no. But do you have a plan for the future? Well, that's usually a question they worry about after they win.
Yeah. One of the critical subjects you address in the book is the housing crisis. And you say that this is one of the first elections where parties need to be appealing to both mortgage holders and renters at the same time. What kind of impact do you think that has on policy options that the parties are putting forward?
Yeah, that's I think the last election was the first indication of what the new, more diverse Australia actually looks like. And I think the people of Australia delivered a shock to the political system at the last election with all those Teal candidates getting up. 6 of them won at the last election, plus Ali Steggall, who won in 2019, is 7. You count Di Lee, who's the independent in the electorate of Fowler, who took the Labor seat, a very safe Labor seat. That's 8 urban independents, plus 4 Greens. That's 12. So you've got a crossbench now, an urban crossbench plus not Andrew Fowler, plus Andrew Wilkie, is 13. That constituency is not a single constituency. It's not an elite, the way some conservative commentators describe it. Within most of those seats, not all of them, but within most of those seats, there's a big surge in the renter population. Now, in some of the higher income electorates closer to the CBD, you're talking about young professionals who want to live where they work and can afford to rent, but they actually can't afford to buy where they want to work and where they want to live. Now, that constituency has been creeping up on Australia because we know that the home ownership rate peaked in the mid-90s, coincidentally towards the end of the Hawke-Keating government, at just over 70%, and it's been creeping down for the last 25 years. And it's been creeping down for more than just the decision of any individual government. It's a global trend. Now, there's been about a 5 percentage point shift from the owner class to the renter class. And once you count them up as voters, the renters are now almost equal in size. The renting households are now almost equal in size to those with a mortgage. And that's the first time we've been in this situation as a post-war democracy since the formation of the modern Liberal Party. You could start to divide the Australian electorate into any number of thirds that you choose, but housing is the one I think that's going to force both major parties and also the minor parties and independents to look at that sort of principal living standard question, what's in it for the home buyer. That's not the only question you would ask yourself when formulating policy. Incentives to keep the home buyer happy, to keep the person with a mortgage happy, don't necessarily align with the interests of renters, because in a sense what you're doing is locking them out of the so-called Great Australian Dream. That politics to me is much more interesting, but it's much more complicated for a party system that's built around the idea of just basically one block owning the middle, which is young families with mortgages, young families with children and mortgages. That's in a sense a double M constituency, married with mortgage. And that household now doesn't decide elections. It may decide another election, could decide the next one or the one after, but in a structural sense, that household is now in competition with younger renters. And we know that younger renters disproportionately live in the inner city. And we know homeowners who have paid off their home disproportionately live in the regions because they're a bit older than the population at large. That's one of the great cleavages now, young and old, owner, renter. The mortgage belt in the middle now feels a little more squeezed in a numerical sense, because to their right, homeowners plus landlords with incentives to maintain the existing tax system and the existing ownership structure. To their left are renters, but educated renters, with a lot of them have got tertiary degrees, who know how to cast a strategic ballot in an inner city electorate. And as I said, the crossbench now has 13, it'll be 12 after redistribution, because North Sydney's been abolished for the next election, but 12 in a parliament, 150 as your starting point. We haven't been here before as a country, with a block of voters who rent, would like to own, but who look at the rest of we'll look at our body clock in terms of our age distribution and look at our income ladder in terms of assets and income. And they're not happy when they look at either of those structures.
Mm. And another kind of demographic analysis that you do is crunching some ABS data and looking at new Australians, second generation Australians, and the kinds of changes that we've seen in the country and where they live. What did you uncover in your consideration of new Australians and second generation Australians?
This is a funny one. So we've sort of been creeping up to a position of being a majority migrant nation again. We're the first English-speaking nation that has either migrants or the children of migrants comprising the majority of the population. First one to return back to majority migrant status since the 19th century. So we're well ahead of the Americans and the Brits and the Canadians, and the New Zealanders are not that far behind us. They'll be next. Now, what that majority means, you would think that it would change the shape of your politics, but it's more complex than that. Again, more interesting. Fortunately, I've been a data nerd. I've looked at the data and didn't bother doing a ring around first. I did the ring around after I got the data. And I found with some of the advisors and a couple of the senior politicians that I interviewed that some of this stuff was a revelation for them as well. I'm not suggesting that I had a scoop that they didn't have. It's that I framed the question a different way and I was looking for the first time. And New Australia now, whilst it's the majority of the population, if you sort of imagine every Australian represented in a family tree, we're first Australian roots, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander roots, an old Australian trunk. You were born here, your parents were born here, and your grandparents were born here, at least 3 generations on this country, with new Australian branches, first and second generation migrant, either born overseas or at least one migrant parent. Now, the branches comprise about 52% of the national population, but across the cities, it's very diverse. Sydney, 67, Melbourne, 64, Perth, 64, Adelaide, Canberra, just over 50%, Brisbane, just under 50%, Darwin, just under 50%, Hobart, under 40%. So already there, once you start to look at the capitals, it's different everywhere. And the tops of the family trees are different everywhere too. You could have taken any census from Federation through to 2011, and the largest overseas-born community in each capital city, town in Australia would have been the same as the national average, which would have been the English. And number 2 would more or less be the same as it was nationally. Until recently, that was migrants from New Zealand. But from 2011 onwards, you've seen every capital city change. The Chinese are the largest overseas-born group in Sydney, the Indians in Melbourne and in Canberra, New Zealanders in Brisbane, migrants from the Philippines in Darwin. As you sort of move counterclockwise around Australia, you get to Perth, Adelaide and Hobart, but the last 3 capitals have still got the English at number 1. So everywhere is different. So what I then did was then have a good look at the change in the population in each of these centres, both nationally, at a capital city level, within the city, and then in the regions. And quite an extraordinary story of diversity in the literal sense of the word, of everywhere being different. And the new Australian population is the thing that's obviously been driving our population growth since the final years of the Howard government. But migrants are having twice as many children as old Australians. And I think that is the critical difference in our political demography. And most of that growth in first and second generation migration is in the outer suburbs of the capitals, especially Melbourne and Sydney, and to a lesser extent Brisbane and Perth. The inner cities themselves, and this is the thing I hadn't expected, but if you sort of look around, you do a look out the window test, you do see that the gentrification within the inner city feels a little more hipster, a little whiter than it might have been 10 or 15 years ago when these were sort of grungy working class, newly arrived migrant centres. My parents from Greece, so they both at different points in their migration journey lived in Richmond. Now, if you walked up and down the Bridge or Swan Street in Richmond now, you'd be lucky to find a Greek, and you'd certainly find a lot more hipster beards and a lot more groovy young things, but whiter than the suburb was about 10, 20, 30 years ago. So when I refer to gentrification actually means that the old Australian population is actually growing faster than the migrant population. That is occurring in a number of these inner city areas outside of the university campuses, because they're the exception to the rule, obviously, with international students. And so when I see sort of Labor as the party of the suburbs, especially the migrant suburbs, and you've seen the Greens and Teals, the party of gentrified inner city, and you see the Coalition as the party of sort of regional and rural Australia, what the Parliament did at the last election, what the electorate did to the Parliament at the last election, was it divided the parties along paths of least demographic resistance. So whilst the country is different everywhere, the parties themselves are sort of a slice of each of that difference. So Labor diverse, Coalition white, Greens and Teals gentrifying and white. 3 different Australias, all wrapped up in the one Parliament. No party yet knows how to build a bridge between them, between young and old, between city and country, and within the cities themselves. And almost a fascinating thing to watch for at the next election is whether that diversity gets re-scrambled again by the electorate, because one of the parties has completely missed the cues from that part of Australia that used to be their safe base, but is changing quite rapidly, changing before their very eyes. And they haven't got their heads around what their new constituents actually want from them as a political party.
Mm. And I suppose the question is also for the Labor Party and how they present themselves. You mentioned that Albanese as Prime Minister has been defending policies of the former coalition government. So, for example, starting off with Stage 3 tax cuts and AUKUS. What kind of effect do you think this approach is having on the base of the Labor Party?
The base of the Labor Party, and it's probably an easy question to answer if you know Labor people, the base itself, the membership base, is to the left of the caucus. So the caucus is a little more middle of the road. The membership itself gets really agitated really quickly when they look at a government that's risk averse. And AUKUS is, I think, the thing that really fires them up. I don't think there's a vote in it either way because at the moment you're looking at a bipartisan deal between Labor and Coalition. You don't see the Teals engaging in the AUKUS issue, and it's really only a matter for the Greens at the moment. For Labor, that tension, trying to keep that base, that agitated base in line, it needs to give them something that makes them feel good about being Labor supporters. Now, in the Hawke and Keating years, they had all sorts of arguments over the American alliance. They had arguments over privatisation. They had arguments over the deregulation of the financial system, later the labour market itself. Those arguments were had in a system obviously, disruptions of things like the internet and the diversity that I describe in the essay, but also those were still the days when the trade unions covered about 40 or 50% of the workforce, and both major parties had pretty diverse membership bases. So, each of the parties had more paid members than the more popular AFL or rugby league clubs. At the moment, the rugby league clubs, and especially the AFL clubs, have more paid up members than either the political parties do at the moment. So back then, those arguments could be had, and the factions actually represented real constituencies as opposed to just personality cults. Today, you look at them and you think, well, narrow base to the left of the elected members of that parliament. How does that AUKUS reignite that base? Well, it's only Labor's under Albanese's only been able to do it once. He tried it with a voice and it didn't work in the end for a number of reasons, but he certainly didn't have the boots on the ground to be able to deliver that vote. Towards the end of that year, 2023, after the sort of setback of the voice, the question of the Stage Street tax cuts was looming again because they were doing mid-reviews of the budget. Was it going to stay in the budget? Were you going to change it? When they changed it so everybody could get a tax cut, and they changed it in a way that took a lot from the top, but the total cost of the tax cuts didn't change. So a lot more went to the bottom and to the middle. Suddenly everybody that was a member of the Labor Party and a few other people as well felt good about the government. And that's probably the sort of big takeout lesson of the first term of the Albanese government. You can try to manage earnestly. You could do, as Jim Chalmers has been trying to do, to balance the books and quietly nudge the Reserve Bank to maybe cut interest rates now because inflation looks like it's under control. Or you could do something dramatic, something that forces every other party in the system to respond to you on your terms, not theirs. And that was the story of the Stage Street tax cuts. I'll give you a hypothetical on AUKUS, because AUKUS is going to be it's almost a wild card at the next federal election if something happens in the US that forces a prime minister or an opposition leader to choose, basically, between an idea of Australia's alliance with the US and the reality of an increasingly unpredictable. It'd probably be predictable in his unpredictability in terms of the second Trump presidency. And if you've got either Australian leader, and this will be a problem for a lot of the allies, if you've got an Australian leader that is cowed by Trump, I don't think that will help them. If you've got an Australian leader that stands up to him or at least defends our interest, you might see something really interesting happening in the polls. I don't know what that scenario will be, but AUKUS is certainly going to be a thing that both parties might want to dance around, because if suddenly Donald Trump says $300 and something billion, no, that's not enough, why don't you double it? And you're paying, you suddenly lose control of your national sovereignty at that point. And I think that is careful what you wish for on the alliance, I think, for both sides at the moment.
Yeah. I'll be opening up to questions in just a minute. Before we get to that, I wanted to ask you about a few times in the essay you mentioned the term protest vote, and in particular in relation to the independents. And I was wondering if you could unpack a bit what you mean by the term protest vote.
Yeah, so I think we look at a protest vote now as an attempt to disrupt a two-party system, traditional politics as usual. And in the Australian context, the protest vote has gone in a particular direction. We know that from the last election. We've had breakouts to the right in the past. Obviously, Pauline Hanson, when she launches her party in 97 and her debut Queensland state election in 98, and then that federal election later that year, there were 1 million people voted number one for One Nation in the Senate that year. It was over 10% of the electorate at the time. So we've had protest votes to the right. But the last couple of terms, we've seen, even in the 2019 election, we've seen an interesting drift away from both sides at once. And I guess there's a bit of a culmination now at that last election when the primary vote between the major and the minor parties split into almost equal thirds. Labor was just under 33%, Coalition's just under 36%, and the third parties, which is minor parties and independents, around 31%. Highest third party vote since the Great Depression, and certainly the highest of the modern two-party system. So when you look at the composition of that vote, what that vote did, especially in those teal and green seats, is it sent politicians to the federal parliament to change it, but with an idea to make the parliament work, not to break it up. And when you think about the protest vote in the US, essentially, if you voted for Trump, you're really asking him to do what he says he wants to do, which is to blow up their system. Certainly, constituents in Wentworth are not sending Electra Spender to Canberra to blow up Parliament House. They want her to advocate for things like climate change, treatment of women, integrity. Now she's talking about tax reform. I mean, could you imagine, say, in the UK system, where they've just thrown out a long-term Conservative government like we did in 2022? By the way, with the Labor Party winning roughly the same primary vote, just over a third for Keir Starmer's Labor Party. They've got a first past the post system, so they win in a landslide. But British Labor, Australian Labor are roughly at the same point in terms of the popular vote, the first preference vote. But in the UK, the Conservative base split and splintered, and a lot of it went to the right. So Nigel Farage is now in the House of Commons. Again, we send Allegra Spender and Zoe Daniel in Melbourne, for example, or David Pocock in the Senate in the ACT. So he was the first senator. He was the first senator to beat a major party senator on his own. So that protest vote, our protest vote, I think almost sits in a unique global category at the moment, because it's trying to force change on the system to fix it, not break it. Mm. And I think the major parties, because now they're sort of they got a bit blinded by the sort of Trump's return. I think they'd be looking at the US election saying, how can we apply the lessons? Labor people would say, well, we need to talk to the working class. Coalition people would say, let's just bang on about migration again, and leave to one side the fact that we're a majority migrant nation. We're a bit harder to pull off in Australia than it is in the US. Or do they look at the last election and think the same might happen to us again? And in fact, we might even have a bigger crossbench at the next election. And they're not Trumpists. I mean, Clive Palmer spent over $100 million at the last election. He didn't knock off any of the Teals. He didn't win seats alongside the Teals. He got a single senator in Victoria. Your major party, and you're looking at the price signal the voter is sending to you, which is, I don't like your brand, and I'm quite prepared to send you in the minority to force you to negotiate with progressive, either centre-right or centre-left candidates, and I'll keep doing that until you listen to me. I mean, I think that's, again, sort of looping back. When I say we're in a global category of our own, I certainly don't see US, UK, or any of Europe where the far right is rising across the board. I don't see any repetition of that here.
Mm. And well, you said, until you listen to me. I wonder whether this will be the new status quo, and longer term, maybe not so much a protest vote as a new normal.
That's possible.
Yeah. We have a question from Deborah Campbell, who says, you forgot to mention Cathy McGowan and Helen Haynes. Yes, a rural seat, but the start of a movement, the first community independent winners. Also Bob Catter on the crossbench and Rebecca Sharkey in South Australia. So do you think there will be more in 2025 is her question.
I wonder... And I try not to look at polls, but I think in the next 3 to 6 months, you'll either get a consolidation of Labor's vote, which will put it in front, and either minority or narrow majority, but more likely minority, Or you'll see what happened at the last election repeat on the Labor side, which is then a splintering to the left and centre left. And again, that would be an urban phenomenon. But the below the line question is whether because Labor being incumbent and most of its seats are in the cities, you'd think that the danger from third parties would be to Labor in the cities. There's still a couple of Liberal seats that almost fell at the last election that are considered vulnerable. There's Sturt in South Australia and there's Bradfield in Sydney. I noticed the coalition now put Paul Fletcher out in the last few days, pretty much trying to save his seat. But he sort of started with the premise that the voters got it wrong by electing Teals in the first place, and probably not the ideal way to address an electorate that's thinking independent. In the regions, because the coalition aren't in power at the moment, you would think intuitively that there was less threat in the regions, but that might not be the case. What may be happening in the regions takes 2 or 3 turns for some of those other independents that we were watching at the last election. If they front again, there might be 2 or 3 coalition seats that go as well in the regions. Now that parliament, if it scrambles in all directions again at the coming election, it doesn't really matter who finishes in front. They're looking at a negotiation with urban crossbench and the regional crossbench. So Albanese would be hoping, that he's still got a 7 in front of his seat count. He's 71, 72, and he needs 4 or 5 to pretty much guarantee supply, and then he can mix and match to get legislation through in the lower house. Don't even start me on the Senate. The Senate won't look the same as the lower house. But he'd be thinking Teals, Katter, Sharkey, Haynes. He wouldn't be thinking Greens. If it were the coalition that finished in front, they'd be thinking Teals and regional MPs as well. So you could see in a way a Haynes, a Sharkey, a Spender, a Daniel, they would really be driving either of those parliaments, either of those governments if they're minority governments. The question is whether either of those leaders of those minority governments would want to go the full 3 years. I don't think Peter Dutton would want a full term in minority government. In fact, I think he'd be looking to pick a fight as soon as possible to call a second election. Mm-hmm. Because if the coalition get in minority government, Labor are demoralised. Like Labor have not finished as a political force, but they wouldn't be in a position to contest a snap election. The other way around, though, Labor's survival instinct would be to go the full term. Anthony Albanese's legacy instincts would be to quit mid-term, to retire as a winner, because there's no way if he goes in minority that he wins the third term. I mean, stranger things have happened in politics, but we haven't returned to government with the same leader since 2004.
Thanks for listening to today's episode of Follow the Money. If you want to join our Australia's Biggest Book Club webinars live, you can sign up via our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or follow the link in the show notes. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the show today, and you can reach out to us via email at podcast@australiainstitute.org.au, or you can find us on Blue Sky at australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget you can order your copy of the first book from Australia Institute Press today. What's the Big Idea offers 32 ideas for a better Australia, from leading thinkers such as Yanis Varoufakis, Amy Ramikis, Auntie Pat Anderson, and Professor Peter Doherty. You can order it now via our website. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and From, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Alice Grundy. Thanks for listening.